thank you to the Hooks Institute for this recognition for franchise. I just want to say that although we are not able to be in person, the warmth and hospitality of our pre-Zoom meeting really shows me the care and the consideration you not only put in this prize, but in commemorating the life of Benjamin Hooks, who actually makes an appearance in franchise. At this time, for my remarks, I'm going to share my screen and walk you through a little bit of the arguments and some of the ideas in my book, Franchise. I like to also acknowledge that while it is always incredibly rewarding to receive the kind of recognition that franchise has received, it is always really meaningful to feel like your peers, other people who are in the archives, other people who understand the struggles of publishing as an academic, recognize the work that goes into your writing. And so this award is particularly poignant for me, not only because it is in the memory of such a civil rights giant, but it's also because of the hard work of the book committee, the selection committee, in recognizing the intersections of scholarship and public-facing work. So when people ask me, how did I come up with the idea to write a book about the relationship between McDonald's and Black America, there are all of these moments that come to mind. But one of them, growing up as a child of the 1980s and 1990s, includes this guy. For those of you who are unfamiliar, he was president of the United States, and his name was Bill Clinton. And during Clinton's presidency, he was often made fun of because of his fondness for fast food. Now, Bill Clinton today, I believe, is now a vegan because of health concerns. But in the 1990s, it was not unusual to see photos like this circulating on the nightly news or in the Associated Press of the President of the United States jogging to McDonald's for a treat. And this image came to mind when I thought about some of the conversations about Barack Obama, the nation's first Black president, and the often referenced quote from writer Toni Morrison about Bill Clinton's Blackness. While very few people have actually referred to the essay in which Toni Morrison talks about Clinton's Blackness, they often remember that she said that he was America's first Black president. But when you look at the actual quote, Morrison wrote, "After all, Clinton displays almost every trope of Blackness: single parent household, born poor, working class, saxophone playing, McDonald's and junk food loving boy from Arkansas." Now, in this essay, Morrison was trying to suggest that the way that Congress was pursuing Clinton during his impeachment trials was in the same ways that Black people are pursued by America's criminal justice system, and suggesting that his racialization came from all of these indicators of how he interacted with popular culture. But Morrison's comment about the Blackness of fast food is something that has always intrigued me. McDonald's is eaten by people all over this nation and around the world. McDonald's is not a business that was necessarily found by Black people. But how did McDonald's become an indicator of Blackness in its relationship to and emergence with Black communities? And in thinking about this issue, I stumbled upon a history of McDonald's and racial unrest that helps us understand the origins of our contemporary concerns about food justice, about nutrition, and about health, and the ways that corporations play a role in our ideas of what we call racial reckonings. This is a picture from Ferguson, Missouri in 2014. And as my biography indicated, I spent a lot of time watching the news out of Ferguson, Missouri, not only as a person who was educated in the state of Missouri, but also a person who was incredibly concerned about the ways that educators would talk about this moment of racial unrest in 2014. I, being a child of the 80s and 90s, remembered the ways that the Los Angeles Rebellion were spoken about, but not discussed with young people. And I wondered how the Ferguson crisis would shape the ways that young people would enter into a new school year. Of the many images that emerged from Ferguson, this one of a Ferguson, Missouri McDonald's on Florissant Avenue was particularly gripping because the images from Ferguson made me think of the images like this from Washington, D.C. in 1968, after the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr., where civil unrest in American streets led to property damage, confrontations with police, and a question about what went wrong and what could be done to solve the problems that were emerging from the long unfinished business of racism. And so in thinking about these two moments, Ferguson 2014, Washington, D.C. 1968, I noticed that there was a pattern in the response to Black grief and Black anger around the social conditions that created these moments. And I also thought about this sign that I often saw in my childhood on a McDonald's in Chicago's South Side that marks the fact that the first McDonald's franchise to an African-American owner-operator emerged in 1968, a mere 8 months after Martin Luther King Jr.'s assassination. This was not a coincidence. In trying to understand why this plaque held such a place of honor on a McDonald's building on the South Side of Chicago and how it connected to Martin Luther King Jr.'s assassination, I found an entry point in reflecting on the civil rights movement that was not only curious and intriguing to me, but I think it brought together some of the ways that we think about the solutions when the problem of racial injustice explodes. And we find ourselves commenting on and trying to repair these moments of racial unrest. So my book franchise is telling the story of McDonald's through the lens of Black communities and telling the story of civil rights through the lens of fast food. And in this process of thinking about fast food civil rights, some of the discoveries that I made that were helpful in my formulation of the relationship between private business and civil rights started at the root in San Bernardino, California, where McDonald's was founded. Now, many of you have probably seen movies like The Founder about Ray Kroc, or have read business articles about the incredible innovation of the McDonald's brothers. All of those characterizations are pretty accurate. But when we look at the experiences of Black America relative to the rise of fast food in the United States, we are able to understand a more complicated and a history that can't be sanitized. Because when we look at the infrastructure that fueled fast food, like the highways that disrupted Black communities and Black neighborhoods, the fact that the road was often a place where Black people traveled with great fear because they didn't know what kind of violence could meet them at a rest stop. They didn't know what restaurants they could stop at without help from resources like the Green Book. We start to see the ways that the fast food industry was predicated on the exclusions of Black Americans from the post-World War II economic boom that helped propel white men like the McDonald's brothers. So throughout my research, I think about the highways. I think about the segregated suburban neighborhoods that created the consumer base and the ascendant white middle class consumers of McDonald's. I think about all of those factors so that we understand that we don't have histories of great American companies. We don't have the history of innovation without the history of racism running right alongside it. The other discovery I found in my research on this topic was the way that McDonald's was a target of serious activism in the desegregation movements that were not only ignited by the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee after the February 1st, 1960 sit-ins in Greensboro, North Carolina, but they were also targets of groups like the NAACP. And according to one Pine Bluff, Arkansas, McDonald's franchise owner, the Black Muslims were also trying to pressure him to desegregate his business. And so what we find is this really curious case that when you talk about the era of segregation, people can often point to businesses that are no longer with us, whether it's Woolworths or Cax's Drugs or Rexall, but rarely do we think of McDonald's as one of those targets as well. And one of the reasons why I think that happens is because towards the end of the 1960s, McDonald's started to graft itself into the story of civil rights through the aggressive recruitment of Black franchise owners and the remaking of the McDonald's story as one that was embracing and progressive of the calls for racial change during that time. And for those of us who witnessed and experienced aspects of the George Floyd summer of 2020, we see some of those same impulses emerge in the wake of calls for racial justice, calls for greater inclusion, and the ways that corporations sometimes rewrite themselves into a narrative of progressive action, when in many ways it's a reactionary move in light of moments of violence and moments of unrest. So the story continues into the moments immediately after King's assassination. And one of the great resources for my book was the Memphis Library's digital archives, where I was able to see the protest against segregated McDonald's in Memphis and to see the incredible work of the Memphis community in the wake of the sanitation worker strike that brought King to Memphis and the aftermath of King's assassination. But shortly after King's death, we start to see these moments in cities like Chicago, where Black-owned businesses are putting up signs that say Soul Brother Business, where there is this deep desire to protect property and property interests by saying, you know, we are one of you. And the role of business in the unrest, I think, is particularly powerful because the Kerner Commission and other Riot Commission reports often talk about the dissatisfaction on the part of Black consumers within their own communities, where they were paying higher prices for lower quality goods or not being hired by the stores that were profiting from their community. And this idea of business ownership becomes front and center as part of the response to the unrest after King's death. So Burgers in the Age of Black Capitalism is one of the chapters that's looking at the emergence of the McDonald's recruitment of Black franchise owners to franchise McDonald's locations that were either abandoned by white franchise owners who no longer wanted to do business in predominantly Black areas, as well as the growth of what would later be called in the early 1970s, Black stores, stores that were in the urban core that were designed for Black operators to be the face of McDonald's in the community. And throughout the 1960s and 70s, and up until today, Black publications like the Chicago Defender, Black Enterprise, which was founded in 1970, Jet, Ebony, Essence, all of these publications feature Black franchise owners as real heroes of their local community. And especially during this period of time, this is a group of people who have access to a level of wealth and ownership that most people couldn't imagine. And so, you know, editorial elements like this photograph and other articles are really putting McDonald's franchise owners in the position that would have traditionally been held by Black funeral home owners, Black bankers, as well as other people who straddle that position between being heads of their own businesses, as well as kind of unelected ambassadors or diplomats for the community. One of the most striking elements of this research was to find the ways that this growth of the Black franchise owner is also happening at the time where we have the growth of the Black elected official, whether it's people like Carl Stokes, who is the first Black mayor of Cleveland, and later we will see similar things with you know, Coleman Young, Maynard Jackson, Harold Washington, Tom Bradley, this Black mayor who is brought into office because of the grassroots organizing of Black communities, who also has an incredible amount of pressure to ensure that white residents believe that this person can also be their mayor. And we saw things like this resonate under President Obama. So all of this is to say that these are incredibly precarious and difficult times for Black elected officials. And in the book, I talk about a controversy in Cleveland, Ohio, in which a series of boycotts are mounted against McDonald's restaurants. And it is not because people are being excluded from service, they're not being refused service. It was because members of the community believed that if there was going to be a profitable McDonald's in their community, it should be Black owned. and that the community should determine who gets to own that McDonald's, as well as the community having a stake or an interest in the investment into public projects from those profits. And so this is a time in which you see a lot of formations, whether it's the creation of Afrocentric schools, the running of political candidates from groups of people who have been formed by the Black Panther Party for self-defense. You start to see this issue of community control, as well as the opportunities that are expanded for Black community control through the War on Poverty programs, right? When these block grants are going to the states and these local community groups are able to access funds to help rebuild their community. So it is in that same vein that groups like Operation Black Unity in Cleveland are forming around this idea of control over the local McDonald's. And McDonald's corporate is not having it. Mayor Stokes is sweating because he feels like he's at the center of this battle. And the reason why I wanted to highlight these confrontations is because I think it's important for us to think about a time where a McDonald's isn't just a place where people stop and have coffee and breakfast or you drive through. A McDonald's was a symbol of something greater and something more complicated, and people were willing to go to the mat in order to determine what McDonald's would mean in their community. And I think that in an era in which people are trying to decide how they feel about corporations, how they can push them, how they can try to raise wages and change conditions, you know, can you fight Amazon? I think it's important for us to highlight this moment where the rules were not entirely written yet. And communities are really trying to mount these different strategies to think about how they can have input on what happens and what unfolds in their own neighborhoods. And in the similar vein, McDonald's and Black organizations get into all sorts of fights throughout the 1970s. I also feature a moment in Portland, Oregon, where the Portland chapter of the Black Panther Party for self-defense is accused of bombing a McDonald's because it refuses to participate in their free breakfast program for children. And it's unclear whether or not the Black Panther Party was behind the bombing, but what is clear is that they are being surveilled by police and the FBI, that there are a series of radical groups that are operating in Portland along a left spectrum that could have participated in this. But ultimately, this idea that the Black Panther Party can make demands on a McDonald's, I think is really incisive to think about just how new this relationship was and the ways that communities felt like they could put pressure on McDonald's to not simply open franchising to Black people, but to actually make some type of impact in the ways that communities were trying to exercise self-determination to get the needs of those communities met. And in the same vein of trying to bend the golden arches, this is a picture of Kent Ford and the Black Panther Party for Self-Defense breakfast program in Portland. There were other attempts to try to slow down the influence of McDonald's. The Ogons neighborhood in Philadelphia made an argument that their neighborhood didn't need a McDonald's, that they needed a library and a mental health center and a youth program, and that their position against McDonald's wasn't necessarily anti-fast food. It was the fact that they did not have a say in what kind of entities were coming into their neighborhood. Similarly, because of the incredible financial success of McDonald's in Black communities, Black performers and Black celebrities tried to get in on the action. And folks as famous as Muhammad Ali tried to create his own burger chain called Champ Burger. This is the opening of a Champ Burger in Miami, Florida. And Mahalia Jackson, the Negro songbird, the great gospel music star, created her own line of fast food fried chicken line called Mahalia Jackson's Glory Fried Chicken. And in each of these instances, the bending of the golden arches is an attempt to say, actually, if you really want to buy Black, if you really want to be invested in Black communities, these are the businesses you should solicit. These are the businesses you should open, and they can become a vehicle for development. So franchising as a concept was wildly popular in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s. And the idea that Black franchises could be a tool for community development groups, youth groups, churches to put money back into their community was a particularly provocative and enticing way of thinking about this business model. But as I reveal in the book, you know, Champ Burger, Mahalia Jackson's Glory Fried Chicken, often these businesses were not Black-owned businesses. They were the result of Black celebrities leasing their name and likeness to these companies that were ultimately white-owned, and were never able to have the kind of capital as well as wealth as the legacy brands like McDonald's to really compete in the market. One of the best parts of this research is the images. I mean, look how cool Muhammad Ali looks in this like burger restaurant. The ephemera that comes out of this period is really just so rich and is really just quite beautiful. And in that same vein, McDonald's marketing in the 1970s to the present, I think, is particularly powerful because in many ways, McDonald's was among the first of the big brands in the late 60s and 70s to go into what was then called ethnic marketing, really trying to represent Black families and Black people through their print advertising and later through their commercials. One of the things that I found is that McDonald's very early on, along with Coca-Cola, is a sponsor of the Black History Month holiday, as well as the Martin Luther King Jr. holiday, which was incredibly controversial upon its passage in 1983. And I remember this video from when I was, 6 or 7 years old about Martin Luther King Jr., about being able to access Black history through McDonald's. And one of the things that I think is really important for us to understand is that there's a lot of discourse about health and nutrition, what people should be eating, what people shouldn't be eating. But one of the things that I hope my research really points out is that history helps us understand that the relationship between who we are and what we eat is complicated. And that by simply trying to think of the issue of health and nutrition as exterminating what people eat, changing what people eat, it loses the fact that there's some real cultural weight of the fast food industry, and particularly McDonald's. When we think about McDonald's sponsoring, the Celebration Gospel Tour, their celebration of and their sponsorship of the All-American Double Dutch League, and this Double Dutch team was later in some of the commercials, and I remember loving these so much, as well as McDonald's sponsorship of the All-American basketball game, that these cultural insights, that these cultural touch points are actually quite significant. And it is easy for us to say, well, it's just McDonald's. But if we think about it from the perspective of the lack of representation of Black people on television, in print culture, in media, the fact that Black cultural forms were rarely used as a selling point to a brand, this is really revolutionary and powerful work. I think that one of the best research days I had was the opportunity to just kind of sit and watch old McDonald's ads from my childhood. It was very emotional, but I think it really does show the rich resonance of advertising culture in not only building memories, but also connecting to people who, if you think about it, if someone is looking at an ad for McDonald's in 1974, they've only been federally protected to be in public in a restaurant for a decade. And so McDonald's making these overtures towards Black consumers was incredibly powerful, incredibly effective for capturing Black dollars and I think Black hearts. So the last two parts of the book go into the 80s and the 90s, when there were a series of conflicts between McDonald's franchise owners and McDonald's corporate over the issue of the ability to expand and to generate more revenue from the McDonald's system. I look at a series of complaints against McDonald's by a Black franchise owner who argues that he is being redlined and he is being kept out of more profitable suburban areas as a franchise owner, because essentially what he argues is that McDonald's confines Black franchise owners to Black communities exclusively. And these are claims that had been made throughout the 70s and 80s. This case gets a little bit more attention. There's some complications with it. But what I note is that it is during this period of time that the NAACP engages in what they call fair share agreements with corporations. and people like Jesse Jackson, who's pictured here. And if you look very closely in the back, there's Reverend Al Sharpton in his 1980s look. And I think that might be Kwesi Mfume right next to him. This is a moment in which the legacy civil rights groups and the emergent ones from the 1970s and 80s, like Operation Push and the National Action Network, are starting to put pressure on corporations to create some type of reconciliation around these issues of race. A lot of these measures lead to more Black-owned franchises. A lot of these measures put money in Black banks. They create more contract labor for Black attorneys and Black advertising and marketing firms. But one of the things that I think that this does, it leaves behind workers. It leaves behind people who are really struggling financially and who are at the heart of the fast food industry and the service economy. And so the Black McDonald's Operators Association engages in a series of negotiations with McDonald's corporate to open up the opportunities as a way to negotiate around these issues of racial discrimination. And finally, I think about, again, civil unrest and the 1990s and the moments after the end of the Los Angeles Rebellion, which was sparked by the acquittal of 4 police officers in the beating of Rodney King, a taxi driver who was beaten by police, and it was captured on video. And it was probably one of the first times people on the nightly news actually witnessed police brutality of that sort in a really long time. And one of the outcomes of the Los Angeles Rebellion was shortly after its end, the McDonald's CEO at the time, Ed Renzi, sent out a memo saying that no McDonald's restaurants in South Los Angeles, which was the epicenter of the unrest, were harmed in the uprising. And I thought that was such a strange comment to make and such a strange idea to circulate, that was one of the entry points into my curiosity about the story about McDonald's and racial unrest. And so when we look at the relationship between fast food and Black communities, we often hear stories around the issues of health and nutrition, around some of the issues that former First Lady Michelle Obama tackled with her Let's Move initiative. We also know that there is an ongoing struggle on the part of fast food workers for better wages and better working conditions. With the 2-year span of the COVID pandemic, we've become more aware, I think, as a society of just the risks that people take in going to work, the need for paid sick leave, and the need for better conditions for people who keep us fed in moments of crisis as well as moments of calm. But I think that there is another story that is important to tell about race and fast food. One that is about the ways that moments of racial unrest and violence and breakdown and grief are often answered not with full-throated commitments to justice and action, but sometimes access to business. And I think that there is an assumption that access to business and access to wealth for some means wealth for all. And I think that we are in a key moment where we have to resist this idea of the trickle-down economics approach to caring for and uplifting Black communities. I also wanted to say before I open it up for your questions and comments that this award is particularly meaningful to me because in my research on Mahalia Jackson's Glory Fried Chicken, I discovered that civil rights activist Benjamin Hooks had taken leave from the Memphis criminal courts in 1968 to be the attorney and head of the Glory Fried Chicken business. And early in my research, I thought to myself, why in the world would Benjamin Hooks do something like this? This is so strange. But what I came to understand about Benjamin Hooks and what I came to understand about Glory Fried Chicken was that 1968 opened up a question, I think, for many people who had struggled during the highs and the lows of the civil rights struggle. And that question was, what is next? After experiencing an enormous amount of change in the integration of the military, in the victory of the Brown v. Board of Education decision, in the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. The foot soldiers of civil rights knew that change was possible, but what they also saw was a federal government that had essentially promised protection and promised a war on poverty and turned its back on these priorities. They saw people in urban cores as well as rural America unable to have enough to eat. They saw schools that their children were legally able to access, unable to provide them a quality education. They saw jobless numbers in the double digits, and they also saw the rise of violence, not only against their leaders, but among their children who were seeking better opportunities or simply a pool to swim in. And so the question of what next was also a question of how much can we take? And the pivot toward business, while it may be easy to criticize or to say was a cynical choice, was about this idea that perhaps ownership, perhaps the financial security of a business that reinvested in the community was the safest route to ending the struggle that they had lived. And so with A.W. Willis and Benjamin Hooks and others, Mahalia Jackson announces this fried chicken partnership. It isn't quite what it seems, but even after the collapse of Glory Fried Chicken, Hooks believed that there was something to do. There was something to build within Black communities. And although we may not have agreed on the routes to finding those solutions, I hope that if he had the opportunity to read this book, he would understand that I embrace civil rights history with not only a critical eye, but an incredibly empathetic heart for the tough decisions and the constrained choices of Black people then and Black people today. And with that, I look forward to your questions and comments. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Chatelain. This was a great presentation. You covered a lot of areas, really compelling information that I think will prompt those who haven't read the book to run out and get the book and read it right away. Because and I will say to our guests, to our viewers, it's a very exciting and interesting read. The only reason it slows down is because you find yourself wanting to do more research. You want to pause those pages and do a little bit more research. So thank you so much, Dr. Chatelain. It's an honor for us to honor you. And I want to thank you for the shout out to our namesake, Dr. Benjamin Hooks. The story continues to unfold on the magnitude of his impact on this country. And, you know, I thought about it even with the ads and the McDonald's commercials. And I too remember being excited, seeing the diversity and seeing our people in the commercials. You know, some of that might not have even happened if it hadn't been for Benjamin Hooks' work on the FCC as the first person of color on the FCC that, you know, made the point that people of color need to be seen on our TV screens. And so it was wonderful to see that recognition and some of our other Memphis leaders. And it was just as exciting to read and see his name in the book and see his story. So thank you for that. I will remind our listeners, if you have any questions that you'd like us to ask, we do have some questions already, but if you have any you'd like to ask, feel free to put them in the chat and we'll get to as many of those as we can. And we'll kind of start from the back and work our way forward. And so one of the questions in your book, you talk about business white flight. We know about neighborhood white flight, but you talk about business white flight and the impact that it had on communities in the 60s and 70s. Do you think that issue is still happening today? We know, you know, it happened, then there was gentrification, many businesses come back. What do you think the status of that, that sense of white businesses being in partnership with Black-owned businesses in urban communities?
Well, I think what we see now is that we might see communities that don't have as many businesses as they did in an earlier period. People will say, oh, see, you know, there's no business, there's no grocery store anymore, there's no a dry cleaner. But a lot of that capital shifted to the rental market. So there's a lot of landlords in those communities, right? So when we think about the white-owned businesses in Black communities, they are real estate. They are properties that are maybe managed by third parties, and a lot of those revenue are going elsewhere. And I think, and they don't create a groundswell of jobs, and they don't have a presence in the community. And so I think that, the period that I look at in the 1960s, people are saying businesses are closing, they don't want to come back, they're cashing out insurance. We know that there's great scholarship on the many mysterious fires that emerged in the 60s and 70s in places like the Bronx. But I think that we also have to keep in mind that a lot of the businesses are still there, but they are in the form of real estate, and it's extractive in a very different way than, the mom and pop corner store.
So there are still the same landowners or property owners, they've just put something different on that property.
I think that's a large part of it.
Okay. And so we actually have a related question. Someone asks that when in your research, did you encounter connections between the building of McDonald's franchises and then the creation of food apartheid areas?
So this is something that a lot of people point to, that, in the urban core, you have a high concentration of fast food restaurants and you don't have grocery stores. A few things to keep in mind, and, the term food apartheid comes out of this idea of where the places to get fresh groceries. During this period of time, a lot of grocery stores, they shutter and they leave the community and they don't want to come back. They also don't have access to the same types of financial assistance as small businesses as fast food franchises do. And so that there's a little bit of a financial disincentive to opening a grocery store. But when you think about what a grocery store contains, there's a lot of food that is not shelf stable. The second your goods come in, they start to go bad. And, in terms of a bottom line, a grocery store, the margins are very thin. You need a lot of workers. In some places, those workers are organized. So you start to see a real sense that certain neighborhoods, certain communities, the investment in a grocery store isn't important. And so there are very few incentives for opening up a grocery store during this period. In the era of gentrification, we see some tax programs. We see more attempts in the inner city to bring grocery stores, but often grocery stores are sometimes the canary in the coal mine in terms of the kind of gentrification that people are concerned about.
Yeah, so they're, kind of sticking with that same time period, when you look at just opportunities for entrepreneurs in general, mm-hmm. and the franchise owners, the African-American franchise owners, the visibility of having those entrepreneurs, did that create any other entrepreneurial opportunities, and how did it contribute to the development and the building of Black wealth?
Well, this is something that people can debate from two perspectives. The visibility of the Black franchise owner, some people say that representation leads other people to think about business ownership or going into other kinds of franchises. The other part of the work of the Black McDonald's Operators Association is to pressure McDonald's to start getting the services of Black suppliers. And some people would argue that the suppliers are really the power players, the people who are able to provide a number of items either through export relationships or through manufacturing. So, for many years, there was a Black-owned sausage company that was providing the sausage for your McMuffin. So those are those opportunities that people think are really vital. The other part of it, people would say, well, that representation is good, but considering the amount of capital that you need for something like a McDonald's, it's not necessarily an accessible kind of business route. There are programs that are supposed to open up more opportunities, but the lift is very heavy. And the question is, can a small business really compete with the capital and the opportunity and the brand name of McDonald's? And I talk a little bit about attempts at Black-owned brands that are not able to compete with the large fast food brands.
Mm-hmm. So you mentioned the McDonald's Black Operators Association. So of course we have to ask your thoughts on the multiple lawsuits by Black franchisees, including some in Memphis. There are two brothers that were the lead on a class action lawsuit, and we know there was a huge class action lawsuit recently settled with a franchisor that owned a lot of McDonald's. I think he was a former athlete.
Yes, it's Herb Washington. You know, these cases are fascinating to me for obvious reasons, but there are patterns that we see from the late 60s to the present. The accusations of redlining, the accusations that, you know, if you're a Black franchise owner, you will only have access to stores in certain areas. Now, there are outliers. There are Black operators who are able to have multiple properties across, you know, a wide swath of a region. But the reality is that Black franchise owners do not have as many restaurants as their white counterparts. They're not capitalized at the same levels. And I think what happened, I think the tipping point was COVID and some of the pressures that the franchise owners found themselves under with COVID. And, you know, McDonald's has the capacity, and they have in the past, you know, they can be very flexible with their financial terms if they want to. They can do rent abatements, they can do forgiveness, they can, you know, help negotiate contracts. That they have things within their wheelhouse to help franchisees out. And I think that this lawsuit was about that. You know, can you activate the power of the corporation to help provide relief for the franchise owners who feel like they have undue pressures on them because of their locations and because of the precarity of the communities in which they do their work. You know, it was my Saturday night reading that filing, because you see some historical trends and the data and the anecdotes that I wish was available when I was writing this book. Because it really is fascinating, and it really shows you the importance of history, right? A lot of arguments in legal cases are arguments not just about the law, but about history and historical trends. And, you know, for the lawyers who were on that case, you know, their history they did a pretty good job.
So in those, if you've actually read the filings, and so in the settlements, did you find that there were any conditions where funds would be channeled into African American communities, or additional opportunities for franchising and entrepreneurship were part of the settlement?
So I did not get my hands on the settlement documents, and I'm sure that there's some terms on those, but the announcements that come out of the settlements are about expanding opportunity, not just for Black franchisees, but Latinx and Asian American, Pacific Islanders. And so this is also a very common thing that, you know, these you rarely see. They don't see the inside of a court. That, you know, the power of the settlement process is kind of where it's going to live and die. But again, this question of opening up opportunity, you know, from my perspective, the greatest thing that could have come out of a settlement like that wouldn't be just about the franchisees. It would say, okay, well, what we're going to do is also, we're going to put our lobbying power on raising the federal minimum wage, give paid sick leave to everyone, absorb any extra costs we need to for healthcare for all, start a childcare program at McDonald's, and, you know, provide more access to our employees to get access to community college and four-year college. Now, I'm not the CEO of McDonald's. No one's going to come up with my ideas, but I think that this is where that connection to social change could be really powerful.
Well, and so, you know, one of the things you mentioned at the very beginning of your presentation was the placement or the involvement, or almost the sanctuary status of McDonald's during the aftermath of the killing of Mike Brown in Ferguson. And then you talked about the same thing with the LA riots related to Rodney King. What do you think is the factors that give McDonald's almost that protection status? Is it because it's a good gathering place? It almost took a sense of a community center in Ferguson.
Well, one of the things, if you travel to that strip in Ferguson, Missouri, you know, Ferguson is not, for people who are not kind of from the Midwest or certain parts of the South, it's hard to imagine a place that isn't a huge city that has Black people. I think that we have there's been such an orientation towards Black as urban, that an urban neighborhood or, you know, a town like Ferguson would look a certain way. But Ferguson is not necessarily, there are a lot of businesses in Ferguson, and there are, places to go. The issue is, where does the economic power in Ferguson rest, and where is it, where people can access it? So all of this is to say is that McDonald's is not that far from the highway exit. There was Wi-Fi, there was air conditioning. It was very hot in those days after Mike Brown's killing, and it also has a large parking lot. So all of these factors for locals and for newcomers, it's like the McDonald's is the place. It was really centrally located, and it was at the end of Florissant Avenue, which was, the entry point to the neighborhood where Michael Brown was killed, as well as, a major strip. So it's kind of in that place, and it has that presence in this moment because they're able to stay open. They're a McDonald's, right? And they are not necessarily a target, though there is a moment where a group of people kind of push through and they break the glass, but they also have a business that has the capacity to, board up that window and open up the next day. And I think that that's the difference, right? If a small business is targeted in that way, it might take a while, a few weeks, for the owner to have enough capital to fix that window, to file that claim. But, it's McDonald's. And so it does make a difference in its capacity to survive and withstand these moments of violence.
So thinking about McDonald's and what they have withstood through the years, their involvement, meetings during the civil rights movement, and looking at today, do you think McDonald's has been impacted by consumer socially conscious decision-making in terms of purchasing, including McDonald's being central in fair wage movements?
I think that McDonald's is like a lot of fast food brands where, keeping up with the 21st century is hard. I think the emergence of fast casual is bifurcating the quick food market. So, or the QSR, quick service restaurant market. So, people with a little more financial needs, they might spend a few more dollars and go to, Panera, Chipotle, or you might spend a few more dollars, you go to the Whole Foods hot bar. I think that there's just a lot of more food options. And I think that socially conscious consumers are very conflicted, not only with the working conditions of fast food or some of the health conditions, but also, the supply, the impact on the environment. And so they're making different choices, but I always want to be really careful about that. Being a consumer is always, you're always in a tough position if you want to do it in the most ethical ways. And I think that what a more productive use of our time isn't to say, this person is bad for eating this and you should be eating that. But what's the kind of world that we want to live in for everyone? The person consuming, the person making your food, the person who harvested it, the person who works in the factory that makes your straw. How do we imagine a world in which, regardless of where we are in that equation, that we're treated and cared for with the dignity that every human being deserves?
Thank you. And so in terms of, I want to ask it, go visit back entrepreneurship. What do you think have been some of the lasting impacts of Black franchise ownership? Has the McDonald's story and legacy, and there's so much separate from the Golden Arches in the Black community, that whole McDonald's story with Ray Kroc, there's a whole story there, but the evolution and the growth of entrepreneurship through the McDonald's franchise, what has been the lasting impact, even for franchisees of other businesses?
Well, I think that the Black franchisees really made a case for Black consumer power. Black people can generate a lot of wealth, and as a result, they need to be represented in commercials. They can't be ignored as a consumer base. And I think that has made a huge difference, not just in the way business is done, but the routes of opportunity that it opens. I have my criticisms of the fast food industry, and I also know that in watching those old commercials, there are a lot of my favorite actors and actresses and singers who got their start on those commercials, right? Like, the circulation of Black culture is no small thing. I think that the wealth generated by the franchise owners, they have, as a group of people, been incredibly philanthropic and community-minded. The support that they give to historically Black colleges and universities, the fact that, in many of their restaurants, this is a place where people can do the business of community. I can't ever undersell that. And I think that, one of the things that it has done, for better and for worse, is to suggest that our nation's, racial morass and our racism can be solved by business, and it can't. But it allows for there to actually be a framework of demand. And I think that anytime we find more places in which we can make demands, I think the better we are.
Thank you. And so just two more questions as our time winds down. Seeing all of the images of the ads and thinking back on the commercials, McDonald's had masterful marketing in terms of being in tune with the Black community. Do you think they were literally listening to the Black community, or they had great marketing people and knew how to appeal?
They had geniuses working.
And then the other question is, does Ronald McDonald have an afro?
It's so funny. I remember, when I was in the 80s, they used to say that, when they had a commercial with Ronald McDonald breakdancing, and there was like an urban legend that one of the breakdancers was from the Break-In movies. If there are any undergraduates watching it, Google it. It's fire. But, what McDonald's did was they had very talented Black people consulting with them, people like C.T. Vivian, people like, Tom Burrell, who creates Burrell Communications, Felix Burrows, who creates Viewpoint. They had people who understood Black people, and they were able to engage in a really important translation process.
Very good. And so the last question is an important question. We've had a question as to where people can buy your book. Where is it available? That's
everywhere.
We want to make sure you get that in.
Wherever books are sold, there's some great Black-owned bookstores that are selling franchise, but the books are everywhere. And if you are interested in the story, I encourage you to pick up a copy.
Thank you. And I encourage also, I want to remind everyone that this presentation will be on the Benjamin Hooks Institute's YouTube channel, but I also urge you to look at other interviews Dr. Chatelain has on YouTube. We couldn't cover everything in this hour that we have with you, but there are some really great, informative, just delightful interviews there. So do look at those as well. So we want to thank you, Dr. Chatelain, for writing this book. We thank your publishers for submitting it for consideration for the Hooks National Book Award. There's really, as Dr. Gazouzian said, there's a very high caliber of publications that are submitted. And so we were delighted and enjoyed discussing your book as a committee. And speaking of the committee, I have to give one more shout out to our book award committee. Many of them have been with this committee, with this process for a long time, and are just a delight to work with. So I just want to thank all of the committee members for your hard work. And it is difficult because we have some very good submissions and we have outstanding finalists every year. So I want to thank the committee, all of you, for your support and for working with the Hooks Institute on this important endeavor. Also want to remind everyone our next event, our next major event will be the premiere of our outstanding film about Ida B. Wells, a Memphis journalist, civil rights activist. I know Chicago feels the connection and has ownership of her as well, but we feel like she got her start with us in Memphis. And so we're very excited about premiering the film on April 19th. And I just want to remind everyone again, before we leave, please follow Hooks Institute. You don't want to miss our future events. Like us, share our events, and spread the word about the great work that we're doing as we teach, study, and promote civil rights and social change. So I thank you all. Thank you, Dr. Chatelain. We're going to get you to Memphis at some point, and just want to encourage everyone to have a good remainder of the week. Our Memphians, I hope everyone gets power soon. So thank you all for joining us.